Hello everyone, and welcome to Classic Gaming Today, where we take a look at the gaming experiences of the past through the eyes of the present. I am your host, Tony, and today we're going to look at Starship Titanic, a first-person point-and-click adventure game developed by the Digital Village and published by Simon & Schuster Interactive for Microsoft Windows devices in 1998, with an Apple Macintosh version following in 1999. We're going to talk about that game in just a couple minutes, but first, as is usual, just a little bit of housekeeping up front. This is episode number 85, and it is a special episode because it is another Patreon-sponsored episode, this one by Rich Senewald. So as we always do, I like to give our Patreon sponsors a chance to tell us why they chose the game that they sponsored. So Rich, take it away.
So one of the tactics you will employ as a child growing up is to convince your parents that something you want might be educational or help you develop as a person. That works quite well with computer games when your parents don't want you staring at the screen so much. I remember spending many hours playing Mavis Beacon Teaches Typing, and later in life, Typing of the Dead. That was great. So, this game, my dad being a fan of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy and Douglas Adams, was a relatively easy sell when I could convince him that I'm able to use typing to do everything, so it'll teach me language and blah 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 blah. In reality, 12-year-old me really struggled with this game. The text parsing I didn't really seem to get on with. I remember just spending a lot of time typing rude words at the robot helpers and not really getting very far. It had so much potential, this game. The introduction was brilliant. I wasn't a huge fan of the Myst-like movement controls, but I loved games like Monkey Islands and Sam & Max, so I was dead keen to play this. Ultimately, I pretty much got about 20 minutes into the game and it was too tough for me. So I'd be really interested in looking at it again in the near future, but also, I just wanted to get opinions I trusted on it. So I don't have a huge amount to say to this game. For you guys, over to Tony.
Thank you, Rich, for your sponsorship, your message, and your support. If you would like to sponsor an episode or just get in touch with me to talk about classic games or technology, there are a few ways you can do that. I have an X account with the handle @ClassicGamingT. I have an email address, which is classicgamingtoday@gmail.com, and we have a Discord server. The link is in the show notes. Discord is the best way to get in touch with me and the rest of the community around this podcast. We have a ton of fun out on Discord. We do weekly and monthly gaming challenges. We have prizes. We have discussions. I highly encourage you all to check it out. I also highly encourage you to check out our Patreon. It's patreon.com/classicgamingtoday. If you want even more Classic Gaming Today goodness, including a Patreon-exclusive bi-weekly podcast expansion pack, patreon.com/classicgamingtoday is where it's at. I'd also like to give a shout out to our Pantheon patrons. They are ISO, Rich Senewald, David Morton, Sam Twardowski, Sean Marshall, Steve Novoselic, and Wendell Jr. Thank you guys for supporting the show. Thank you all for supporting the show, whether you contribute monetarily or simply listen on a regular basis. I truly do appreciate all of the support. I'd also like to give a special shout out to our newest honorary patron, Maximus Marshall. Maximus is one of our younger listeners at 9 years old, but he's going to be 10 in just a couple weeks. That is double digits, and that is a big deal. Maximus, happy early birthday. I hope you get everything that you want, and thank you for listening to the show. For anyone who may be new, welcome. I'd like to give a brief overview of the anatomy of an episode because, for the most part, all of our episodes follow a very similar format and structure. We will always start by talking about the history of the game in question, the historical context, how was the game made, why was the game made, and then we move into a pseudo-review kind of section. And I say pseudo-review because it's not like we assign numerical rankings or star counts or anything like that, but we do talk about every single game from several different perspectives. We take a look at the graphics. How does the game look? The sound and music. How does the game sound? The narrative and or story, if the game has one. Playability and controls and overall feel. What does it feel like to play the game today versus when it was released 20, 30, maybe even 40 plus years ago? We do all of that to reach a verdict as far as how well the game holds up today. And to do that, we assign each game to one of several categories. At the very top of our list is the Pantheon of Classic Gaming. If a game reaches the Pantheon, you know it is that darn good. It is a certifiable classic. You should go out of your way to play those games today. Just beyond the Pantheon are our golden oldies. These are still really good games. I still highly encourage you to play them, especially if you enjoy the genre in which the game exists. By all means, you should have a good time. They're not quite Pantheon level, but they are still really worthwhile experiences, and I still highly encourage you all to play them today. Beyond the golden oldies, we reach our mediocre mentions. This is where we start getting into the realm of games that I cannot recommend to the broad population. They might have aged a little bit, might have had a couple of issues to begin with. You may still have a good time, especially if you enjoy the genre in which the game lives. By all means, give it a go, but I cannot recommend these games to the broad game-playing population. And then beyond the mediocre mentions, we reach the footnotes. These are the games that are best left in the annals of history. I have played them, so you don't have to. I cannot recommend anyone play these titles today. They have either aged incredibly poorly, or they may not have been all that great to begin with. With that out of the way, we're going to start talking about the game of the day. That is Starship Titanic. Starship Titanic is a first-person point-and-click adventure game developed by the Digital Village and published by Simon & Schuster Interactive for Microsoft Windows in 1998, with an Apple Macintosh version following in 1999. Before we can talk about Starship Titanic, we need to talk about the visionary behind the game, that being Douglas Adams. Many of you may recognize the name Douglas Adams, most likely from his most popular series of novels, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, as well as its various adaptations and, potentially, some of his other literary works. But what many of you may not realize is that Adams was, even from the early 80s, a key figure in adventure game development, having worked with some pretty notable adventure game studios from the time period, like Infocom of Zork fame, and Lucasfilm, who was the predecessor to LucasArts, and one of the eventual behemoths of the adventure game genre. Adams didn't begin his career with aspirations to develop games, most prominently because games in the context that we know them were just being created for the first time as he was growing up. Adams was born in 1952, and from a very early age, he demonstrated his talent for writing, and more specifically, writing comedic stories. That talent was on display throughout his school-age years, and he eventually parlayed that talent into actual work, having the opportunity to write for several well-known British radio and television series, the most well-known being Monty Python and Doctor Who in the 1970s. It was his work on those programs that would eventually lead to his most famous creation, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Before we talk about The Hitchhiker's Guide, though, it's important to understand a little bit about Douglas Adams' writing style, as it will play a major role in understanding his future work in adventure games. Adams was, as mentioned previously, a comedic writer, and one who often used science fiction as the backdrop of his stories. But he set himself apart from many other authors due to his writing style, whereupon he relied upon clever wordplay, outrageous situations, comical and illogical solutions to conundrums, and other non-standard techniques to create brisk-paced narratives that appealed to fans of both science fiction and comedy. Speaking from the perspective of someone who has read a fair portion of Adams' work, you absolutely know when you're reading a Douglas Adams story, and it is something that is incredibly difficult to mimic and reproduce, as can be seen by some of the posthumous efforts of other authors attempting to imitate Adams' style to create add-on stories to some of his more popular series, which from my perspective is a pale imitation. This style is what Adams became known for, and he would leverage that same style across all of his artistic endeavors throughout his career, including, eventually, computer games. Keep the stylistic elements of Adams' work in the back of your mind, because we're going to return to it in a little bit. For now, though, we'll return to our discussion on The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which began its life as a pilot script for a radio program before being converted into a series of novels and, eventually, stories across various media, including television, film, stage, and radio. If the story ended there, however, then it wouldn't have much bearing on this podcast, but interestingly for us, Adams was interested in pursuing all forms of media, which in the early 80s included software for the personal computer. Before Adams took much of an interest in developing a game himself, or at least via collaboration with an actual game developer, numerous individuals attempted to reach out to work with the Hitchhiker's Guide property, and one individual by the name of Bob Chappell actually received permission to work on a game in the Hitchhiker's universe. This was back in 1981, and at the time, both Adams and his publisher didn't really have much idea what it meant to have a text-based adventure. So permission was granted with only the need for attribution, similar to how some royalty-free music is available today if you attribute the creator of the piece. It was probably one of the easiest quote-unquote licensing deals in computer game history, especially considering the popularity of Adams' books. Now, some of you may be saying to yourself, who is Bob Chappell? I don't recall him being a prominent game designer. And with that thought, you would be right. It doesn't appear as though Chappell did much in the computer industry beyond creating one of, if not the first, game based on a Douglas Adams property. And even then, the British computer game market was so small at that point that the game that he created received little to no attention at all. After that initial effort, there were various efforts to create unauthorized games in the Hitchhiker's universe, most of which were met with extreme resistance and intellectual property protection, oftentimes being required to restructure or change the contents of the game dramatically in order to not be faced with a lawsuit. This was due largely to the fact that Adams had just recently entered into an agreement to develop a film based on the Hitchhiker's Guide, and as a result, there was much more focus on protecting the license with a certain degree of oversight, rather than allowing the potential for less than stellar games to tarnish the reputation of the license and potentially lead to negative perception amongst the general public. It warrants mentioning, by the way, that the Hitchhiker's Guide became insanely popular around this time frame, which is why it was often sought to be both expanded into additional novels while at the same time being adapted into various forms of media. This might be apparent based on the discussion thus far, but just to be clear, this was a major, hot new property that tons of people were clamoring for more of. Between 1981 and 1983, Adams had become more and more enamored by technology, and would eventually begin playing computer games in his spare time as a way to combat writer's block that he would sometimes face when working on a new story. While he played a variety of games during that time frame, the ones he enjoyed most had been developed by Infocom, which was the company most known for the Zork series of interactive fiction titles. Adams expressed his preferences to his US book publisher, Simon & Schuster, and they in turn went directly to Infocom and effectively told them that Douglas Adams was interested in creating a game with them, set in the Hitchhiker's universe. This understandably made Infocom extremely excited, as the Hitchhiker's Guide was, as previously mentioned, a major property that could potentially put Infocom on the map beyond the more hardcore computer gamers that they had, up to that point, been catering to. Unfortunately for them, Simon & Schuster's offer was a gross misrepresentation of what Adams actually had communicated, which was simply respect and admiration for the company's work. Still, Adams wasn't opposed to the idea of creating a game with Infocom, though his preference would have been to work with some of the developers of the games that he had enjoyed most, primarily a man named Mike Berlin who had created the game Suspended, of which Adams was particularly fond of. Berlin, however, did not want to work on the project at all. It's not clear exactly why he didn't want the potential fame that would have come with the collaboration, but his refusal led to the beginning of what would ultimately become a successful working venture, that being Adams being paired with Steve Meretzky, who had, interestingly, created a game previously called Planetfall that bore a lot of similarities to Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. The original deal between Infocom and Adams was for the creation of 6 distinct adventure games, though only one, the original Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, would be created. That game would be developed in 1984 and would, to put it bluntly, not follow traditional adventure game tropes and techniques, often requiring exceptional and unpredictable leaps of logic to arrive at puzzle solutions. The Digital Antiquarian on his blog does a great job of calling attention to many of the puzzles and interesting design decisions that went into that game, with probably the most notable and telling design decision being that Adams wanted Meretzky to break the rules of traditional adventure game logic and puzzle design. While this may have seemed like a great idea to the creative mind of Douglas Adams, and was somewhat bolstered by strong sales after its release, the game was also met with criticism regarding the difficulty of many of its puzzles, and it's here that I feel the need to provide my own personal commentary, as I want to dive a little bit deeper into why I believe Douglas Adams' design philosophy, at least as it relates to games, is inherently flawed. Douglas Adams' wit and comedy relies heavily upon the outlandish situations that his characters find themselves in, and the clever usage of wording and phrasing evokes a feeling that can best be described as quirky, unabashedly British humor and observations. When reading a story where the thinking is done for you, these situations present themselves as comedy and are hugely enjoyable. However, without the aid of a narrator or author to provide context and make the illogical leaps that, for some reason, work on the written page, I would argue that not many people would figure out how to solve nearly any of the situations that the main characters of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy face throughout the course of their adventures. The issue, as it relates to converting that experience to a computer game, is that you are now forced to come up with the solutions to those puzzles and situations yourself, oftentimes without any sort of hint that there was the potential for doing any given action. This results in a game that is difficult not because of the logical leaps required to arrive at a solution, but because of the need to understand what the designer, in this case Adams, had in mind. This is commonly referred to as moon logic, and is a staple of many early adventure game experiences. The difference here, however, is that while some puzzles required insane logic to complete, most games have a certain consistency to their world such that when you do finally figure out, or look up the solution, you can at least see some sort of connection, no matter how tenuous. What struck me most about the depictions of the puzzles in The Hitchhiker's text adventure was how consistently inconsistent it was in following the rules of traditional adventure gaming. That doesn't make it a poor experience per se, and I would argue that the writing is stellar and the comedy is as good as Adams' literary works, but it does make for a frustrating playing experience. Personal opinion aside, the game did receive a lot of widespread attention and sold very well for the time, making Infocom a lot of money and making their name more well known than many other game developers of the time. Adams himself would go on to dabble in the gaming industry beyond that initial game, helping to brainstorm design ideas for the Lucasfilm adventure game Labyrinth in 1986, and working on another Infocom interactive fiction game, Bureaucracy, in 1987. Beyond that, though, most of Adams' attention was on other endeavors. However, he never totally stopped thinking about technology and the way computer games could be used to tell a story, which brings us to 1993 and the release of a game many of you have probably heard of, Myst by Cyan Worlds. Adams became enamored with Myst and its sequel Riven, but had complained that he didn't think the story or characters were strong enough in the games. He believed that he could create something better, and thus the very early concept for the game version of Starship Titanic was born. Note, I say game version because Starship Titanic was itself originally mentioned in Adams' third Hitchhiker's Guide novel, entitled Life, the Universe, and Everything, but there was little to no exposition beyond simply stating it existed. Adams took the opportunity to expand upon that concept, combined with the goal of delivering a narrative-based Myst-like adventure, and he went about setting the wheels in motion to achieve his vision, whose development officially began in 1996 with the founding of a new company, The Digital Village, by Adams and several business partners. The majority of adventure games of the time consisted of a couple of different broad types. On one hand, you had the traditional third-person point-and-click adventure game popularized and perfected by companies like LucasArts, Sierra Online, and Revolution Software. On the other, you had the proliferation of first-person adventure Myst clones, brought about as a result of Myst's success and the desire for companies to grab a slice of the growing first-person adventure market. There were other subgenres around at the time too, of course, like interactive movies, which we've talked about before because you all know I love FMV-based titles, and, though more niche, interactive fiction. But Adams wasn't interested in pursuing something standard. Instead, he envisioned a game that would combine the interactive fiction text parser-based elements of his prior Infocom games with a graphical display reminiscent of Myst. Basically, he wanted the best of both worlds, a throwback to the style that he knew well, and the opportunity that came with developing a first-person adventure during a time when first-person adventures were selling extremely well. This was, to put it mildly, a revolutionary concept at the time, and could have heralded a new era and genre of adventure gaming. And the team dedicated to its creation certainly put in the effort to create something special. The game had an insane amount of content created for it, with over 300,000 written words and 16 hours of dialogue available in the game, spread across several distinct robotic characters, all with their own personalities and responses to a set of 500 or so keywords that could potentially apply to any given situation. This parser interface was based upon a natural language engine called Spooky Talk, which was created by the Digital Village specifically for this game, and was itself based upon software called Velocitext, which had been developed by a company called Vertis Corporation. A huge amount of effort went into building the characters in the game and ensuring that the player's interactions with those characters felt realistic, with significant attention paid to how certain phrasing could potentially change the meaning of what the player was typing into the game's parser. Interestingly, the original intent for the game was to use text-to-speech synthesis as a way to really double down on the potential for generative dialogue based on whatever the player might type into the parser. This, however, would prove to be a challenging problem to figure out, and to provide some context, natural language processing is, even today, quite difficult to perform accurately. We've seen huge strides in developing more natural understanding between humans and machines, focused in prior years on virtual cognitive assistants like Alexa, Siri, and Google-based products, and perhaps most significantly over the course of the last year, focused on ChatGPT, which has taken the concept of natural language processing to a whole new level. Putting ChatGPT aside, which, like I said, is its own special flavor of awesome, today it's not uncommon to be able to assign other virtual assistants simple tasks, or ask them questions that they gladly answer. It's also not uncommon to say something to your virtual assistant and have them totally misunderstand what you told them, owing to the difficulty in interpreting any language without the benefit of having true cognitive context available to you. That, for reference, is 2024, and I would argue that natural language processing truly only became somewhat natural in 2023 with ChatGPT taking the world by storm. Starship Titanic, by contrast, was created in 1996. To say that the parser, though undeniably ambitious, was less technically proficient than modern systems is a gross understatement. It was absolutely awesome at the time, and there were some clever tricks put in place to make it feel like you were having an actual conversation with the robotic characters on the ship. But all it took was one oddly worded phrase, or misspelling, or unrecognized keyword, or any other natural mistake, so to speak, to make the illusion disappear. Ultimately, it was probably a good idea to use voice-acted lines and dialogue, as opposed to a more robotic text-to-speech kind of situation, as I can't imagine the text-to-speech synthesis would have been nearly as engaging as the acting that the game actually included. We'll talk more about my own experience in playing with the parser later on, so I'm not going to get into details here. But suffice it to say, the team's ambition outpaced the technology and design available to it at the time. The bottom line is, text parsers and natural language processing is hard. I commend Adams and the team for trying to do something truly revolutionary, but in doing so, they created an experience that was certainly more challenging than the traditional point-and-click adventure of the time. And speaking of difficulty, and tagging on to the quantity of writing and dialogue included in the game, we see the same kinds of things here as were prevalent in the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy text-based game, with significant attention placed on the writing, comedy, and acting, as well as the quirky British sense of humor, which collectively creates a memorable experience that transcends the act of playing the game itself. The puzzles, on the other hand? I won't go into more detail just yet, but suffice it to say, I will have some commentary on these puzzles during our pseudo review of the game. Editorial aside, a great deal of care was devoted to the creation of the game, both from a writing perspective, as mentioned previously, as well as a visual and sound design standpoint, as the company used individuals who had previously worked on Academy Award-winning films to create its art design, some of which was based on real-world architecture and Art Deco buildings, and the voice acting, as I alluded to earlier, was intended to be top-notch. Here, Adams was able to utilize some of the acquaintances he had made throughout his career, including several members of Monty Python and other prominent actors in British film and television. The result was voice work that was delivered impeccably, and for those individuals who enjoy British humor, were at times considered to be truly laugh-out-loud funny. Further, because the game was developed to be different than the prominent adventure games of the time, and like we talked about, a combination of text parser and graphic first-person experience, a new engine needed to be developed, which the team called Lifeboat, which I thought was an awesome engine name for a game with Titanic in the title. There's not a whole heck of a lot of information about the Lifeboat engine, and I'm pretty sure it was only used for this game. But it did serve its purpose, which was to create a way for various aspects of the game to be worked on concurrently, as well as unifying the point-and-click style of interaction from games like Myst, combined with the text parser input from the interactive fiction domain. It was certainly a unique, ambitious engine in comparison to the standard adventure game engines of the time, and I kinda wish we saw more games utilize the technology. Unfortunately, that would never happen, and Lifeboat would become a one-off engine made and utilized for only one singular game. Between the graphics and voice dialogue, the game was stored across 3 CD-ROM discs and was eventually repackaged into a single DVD release a couple years after it first came out. As longtime listeners of the podcast know, the proliferation of low-cost and massive for the time storage technologies in the 90s enabled gaming experiences that were, up to that point, impossible. Many companies took advantage of the space afforded to them by CD-ROMs, and by the time Starship Titanic came out, the technology was pervasive across the industry, unlike when games like Myst and Seventh Guest came out years earlier, which was a strong driver for the initial sales of CD-ROM drives. In what I thought was an interesting story, there was actually a data budget for the game of approximately 1.8 gigabytes, which is effectively 3 650 megabyte CD-ROM discs. This budget led to different requirements for the team to compress and store the graphics, music, voice, and cutscenes that were prevalent throughout the game, such as using the relatively new MP3 compression technology for all of the dialogue so as to fit within the 3 CD-ROM limit the game designers were targeting. I note this because, in the era of gaming when CD-ROM was most prevalent, I've often heard of games ballooning across multiple discs because of the significant scope of the experience. This is the first time I've heard of a company saying you must keep it within a certain size, which certainly doesn't mean it was the only time it happened, and I can guarantee you I'm sure there were other companies directing similar requirements to their development staff, but regardless, I did find that interesting. Despite missing its initial launch window in 1997, the game was finally released in 1998 via a co-publishing deal between Simon & Schuster Interactive, where Simon & Schuster was, as you may recall, Douglas Adams' US-based publisher, and the Digital Village Gaming Company. It was advertised and released with a great deal of fanfare and expectation, with an initial production run of 200,000 copies, which Simon & Schuster expected to sell out in relatively short order. But unfortunately, sales would fall well short of those expectations, selling only 150,000 copies in the United States in its first year of release, with not many sales to follow. In another interesting piece of trivia, the book version of the game, which was unfortunately written by author Terry Jones and not Douglas Adams, was released in 1997 before the game itself was released. I haven't read the book yet, so I'll withhold any sort of judgment on the quality of the writing until I do have a chance to personally read it. But I will reiterate my prior belief that it is very difficult to accurately, and with the same feeling, imitate Douglas Adams' writing style and quirky British wit. Several well-known authors have tried, and while they can sometimes create a reasonable facsimile, I have yet to read a work that achieves its goal of truly mimicking a Douglas Adams story. Despite less than stellar sales and relatively mixed critical response at the time of its release, Starship Titanic would end up being nominated for and winning several industry awards, including a Cody for Best New Adventure Game in 1999. The more positive critical feedback focused on the quality of the writing and acting, while the more negative entries noted the illogical and obtuse nature of some of the puzzles, resembling more of the old-school adventure game mindset, and in particular, Adams' prior efforts on Hitchhiker's Guide, as well as an ineffectual text parser and convoluted narrative that oftentimes could make players feel like they weren't sure what action or step to take next in order to advance the story. While the game would gain a fair number of fans over the years, most prominently because of Douglas Adams' involvement, Starship Titanic itself wouldn't have much of a legacy. It resulted in no sequels, no remasters, and other than a modern release on Steam and GOG, there's really not a ton of modern discourse on the title. Interestingly, the game's forums, in which users created a fictional online community where they roleplayed employees and passengers of the titular ship, has had a longer-lasting legacy than the game itself, with various anonymous internet fans contributing their own content for years following the game's release. Unfortunately, it appears as though even these fan forums are now shut down, though if you plumb the depths of the internet, you can find some archived websites that are so 90s that it kinda hurts the eyes. Literally. Anyone who ever had a GeoCities site knows exactly what I'm talking about here. Anyway, mild tangent aside, Starship Titanic, while not the most popular game, and not a title with a ton of legacy, does occupy an interesting space in computer game history. It represents the attempted modernization of a truly old-school 1980s adventure game experience, paired with the more modern for the time first-person gameplay that games like Myst and Seventh Guest would popularize, and combines all of that with the wit and comedy of Douglas Adams, a combination that on paper sounds like a match made in heaven. While I'll talk at length about whether the reality matches the assumed awesomeness, the fact is that Starship Titanic does, in fact, deserve your attention today, even if only to see a highly experimental title from the late 90s come to life on your computer screen. It may not have achieved any degree of huge success amongst the broader gaming population, but for fans of the game, Starship Titanic is one of those titles that will remain a fond memory, and is an experience that those fans will likely always appreciate. We are now going to shift to start talking about what it feels like to play Starship Titanic today versus when it was released a little bit over 25 years ago. So Starship Titanic, like we talked about, is both a traditional first-person adventure game experience as well as a pretty non-traditional 1990s adventure game experience, and this dichotomy likely warrants a little bit of additional discussion. So let's talk about the overall structure of the game, which is effectively a two-sided coin. One side of that coin represents the traditional first-person adventure gameplay, where you navigate through various environments in a first-person perspective, with various objects to pick up, hotspots to interact with, characters to speak with, puzzles to solve, and environmental clues to observe. Navigating around the game world is accomplished solely using your mouse, with standard arrow icons appearing on various sections of the screen as you move your mouse around, depicting areas where you can move to. Clicking in the screen areas where those arrows appear will move you to whatever the linked screen is, most often with some animation or pre-rendered short cutscene playing as you move around the interior of the Starship Titanic, the spacecraft on which your adventure takes place. As you play the game, different areas will open up as you manage to acquire upgrades to your passenger status, which I will admit is a fairly novel in-universe way to block content based on progress. In Starship Titanic, you begin the game as a poor schlub who, if you were on the real Titanic, would likely have accommodations far below deck, probably right outside of the coal room. As you might expect, your low stature prevents you from exploring the majority of the ship, as in order to gain access to other areas of the game world, you need to upgrade that status, first to second class, and eventually to first class, which will give you the opportunity to explore the ship in its entirety. Getting to second class is relatively straightforward and telegraphed pretty clearly by the game early on, while getting to first class is a bit less straightforward and relies a bit on some very specific observation and, somewhat importantly, the in-flight magazine that came with hard copies of the game and is also included with many digital copies today. Now, you might be saying, wait a tick, you actually need to use the supplemental materials you get with the game to be successful in the game? And my answer to that is, sort of. We'll talk more about this in a little bit, but the majority of the puzzles and plot and things to do in the game are pretty hidden and not obvious. The materials that came with the original game are all written as an in-universe reference, and they do contain some very light and subtle hints. In regards to getting the first class status, there is a slight hint in the materials that in-game you would have almost no way of knowing how to accomplish, short of trial and error, dumb luck, or incredible observational skills. Anyway, I won't belabor the point on that one puzzle because there are a ton of puzzles and obstacles to get through in the game, as well as inventory items to use, just like the majority of many first-person adventure games. What makes Starship Titanic unique, though, is the second side of the coin I mentioned earlier, which is the text parser interface, which is almost as important as the traditional first-person point-and-click gameplay that you use to navigate and interact with the game world. The main concept behind the text parser interface is that as you make your way around the ship, you'll encounter a number of different robot inhabitants, all of which you can speak with or issue commands to, assuming you know the right thing to say. As an example, if you go into an elevator, you'll need to tell the lift bot in the elevator which floor you want to go to, rather than pressing a button on the wall. This, when it works, feels awesome, because it gives you a sense of being more engaged with the game world and story than what you typically feel when dialogue options are simply presented to you to select from. Obviously, the elevator robot example is super simple, but you can talk to these robots about a number of different topics, and ostensibly, these robots are the way you can potentially learn about what to do in the ship, where to go, and how to solve various puzzles you'll encounter. There are even a couple robots, the bellhop robot and a pseudo-butler kind of robot, that you can call whenever you want, mostly, and those two robots are your primary means of getting hints and direction for playing the game. And, like I mentioned earlier, there were over 16 hours of dialogue recorded for the game, which is absolutely massive. You would assume that such a huge amount of content would make the game feel lived in and really engage you as a player. Well, we'll talk about that and the rest of the more specific aspects of the game in just a couple minutes, but first, we do need to take a look at the back of the box, because, as you all know, I love looking at the back of the box for these games. I love learning how different companies marketed their titles, especially around the time frame that we usually look at games from, because back then, we did not have a pervasive internet. We did not have YouTube to look up gameplay videos. When we made a decision on what game to buy, in the store, holding a box in hand, did the front of the box look cool? Did it make us want to turn it over and read about what was on the back of the box? And then did the back of the box make it sound interesting enough for us to ultimately purchase the game? So, for Starship Titanic, for the Microsoft Windows computer platform, the back of the box says, possibly the most bizarrely imaginative game yet by PC Gaming World UK. The game itself is complex, involving, deliciously absurd, and hilarious by the Daily Telegraph. That is Starship Titanic, a new adventure game from Douglas Adams, creator of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. A master at creating futuristic sci-fi puzzles, paradoxes, and other logical perplexities, which was written by Computer Life. At the heart of our galaxy, an advanced civilization of which we know nothing has built the biggest, most beautiful starship ever, the Starship Titanic. Majestic and luxurious, its interior resembles a mixture of the Ritz, the Chrysler Building, Tutankhamun's tomb, and Venice. Starship Titanic is a technological marvel, and it cannot possibly go wrong, in theory. Seconds into its maiden voyage, it crashes into hyperspace, vanishes, and collides with your house. Bewildered, you find your way aboard, and just as you are gazing at its awe-inspiring interior, the ship takes off again and heads deep into space. You are stranded, but you are not alone. The ship is inhabited by a crew of malfunctioning robots and a semi-deranged parrot. You discover that you can communicate with them, a feat that is made possible by Spooky Talk, the game's proprietary interactive language engine. You can chat with any of the robot characters, like Fentable, the distinguished doorbot, Nobby, the hypochondriac liftbot, or Fortillion Bantaburn O'Perfluous, the outrageously convivial barbot. Talk to them, interrogate them, give them orders. They will listen to you, answer you, and, if they happen to feel like it, obey you. Sometimes. To begin with, you are a third-class passenger, and you quickly find yourself in the grip of one of the most powerful forces known to modern man, the desire for a free upgrade. As you move up to second and at last to first class, more and more of the ship becomes accessible to you, and more of its mystery unravels. What has happened here? What terrible events occurred the night before the launch? Who is the mysterious Titania whose brooding statues dominate the ship? Can you solve a series of increasingly bizarre and surreal puzzles, unlock the central mystery, and return to Earth before the parrot drives you finally and irrevocably mad? Features: all original interactive characters and game design by Douglas Adams. Stunning cinematic interiors from the Oscar-winning design team of Oscar Ciccone and Isabel Molina. Spooky Talk, a cutting-edge natural language text parser enabling complex and entertaining conversations between the player and the game's characters. And then there are a few screenshots on the back of the box to show you what the game looks like, and I have got to say, this was one of the more dense, story-filled, and entertaining backs of the boxes that we have looked at. This absolutely would have sold me, and I remember seeing Starship Titanic in stores around that time. I just wasn't really feeling a first-person adventure back around the time when the game first came out. I was kind of playing other games, but this would have definitely sold me if I took the time to really read the back of the box, and the wit and comedy of Douglas Adams kind of shines through even in this brief summary. So yes, this box absolutely sold me. The question is, will the game hold up to the quality of the box? And we're going to find out about that right now as we start diving into the more specific aspects of the game. We're going to start by talking about the graphics. Starship Titanic, as a late 90s pre-rendered first-person adventure title, has graphics that are pretty much exactly what you would expect for a quality visual experience from around that time frame. The entire ship is modeled with a pretty deep level of detail, with reflections on certain surfaces, high-quality 3D imagery, and well-designed rooms, hallways, and locations that feel like something you would see in a true futuristic spacefaring cruise ship. Navigating around the starship is a visual treat, and I enjoyed looking at the architecture and design elements that made up the environments of the game. Navigating around the ship is accompanied by animation between screen transitions, sometimes very quick, while other transitions are almost like mini cutscenes. In all instances, this additional transition animation is appreciated, as some of the earlier first-person adventure titles like Myst relied on effectively no transitional graphics or motion, which made those experiences feel a bit more like a slideshow and less like an interactive game. That isn't an issue with Starship Titanic, and while the transitions themselves are nothing to write home about, they still add something to the overall experience. The longer animated cutscenes that are truly cutscenes all look great for the time that they were made, though when looked at through a modern lens, definitely show some compression artifacts during playback. They still look fine, but you can tell these were older rendered cutscenes using more restrictive storage technology than what we have to worry about today. Outside of the environmental design, the game also includes several robotic characters, like I mentioned earlier, and each of those characters are designed fairly well, though admittedly, the graphics design for those robots feel very much like semi-early 3D character models. Part of the design for each character was likely intentional, given the British humor and general Art Deco design elements in the rest of the game, while other parts of the design feel a bit more constrained by technology, as opposed to simply being a design decision. That's not to say that the characters look bad, because I think they actually look pretty darn good. It's just that the character design does feel a bit older than other elements of the title's visual appearance, which honestly could probably be remastered fairly easily using AI upscaling technologies, which I'm guessing would make the game look much more high definition. Even without any potential remaster, the game as it exists exudes quality visuals, and I have no real complaints about the graphics in the title. Oh, though I should also mention, there are a few FMV sequences included in the game as well, with at least one starring Douglas Adams himself. You all know I love FMV, and even though it's a very minor part of the game, I still enjoyed its existence. Moving on to the sound and music, the music in the game is really well done, with a memorable main theme and high-quality ambient tracks that all make sense given the environments that you're exploring. From a musical perspective, I literally have no complaints. Now, I don't think the music here competes with some of the more classic third-person point-and-click adventure titles from companies like Sierra and LucasArts, but when taken as a standalone auditory experience, Starship Titanic delivers. The music, though, is not the star of the show when it comes to audio. Instead, the standout piece of the game's auditory environment has to be the voice acting that brings each robotic character and one parrot to life. I've got to say, the voice acting here is simply superb, and I loved the personality that every single actor brought to their roles. At no point while playing the game did I think to myself, oh, that voice is lower quality, or that voice doesn't match the character. No, in every instance, the voice work here is absolutely perfect. And even for certain roles that you could potentially not even meet in your playthrough, like an easily distracted bomb, the quality is consistently high. And by the way, that bomb that I just mentioned is voiced by none other than John Cleese. Someone of his caliber voicing a role that you don't even need to talk to complete the game? I found that pretty shocking. The bottom line is, the voice work is excellent, and every actor that contributed to the title did so with a level of professionalism and talent that was rare in computer and video games, even in the late 90s. The voice acting is definitely one aspect of the game that stands head and shoulders above its peers, and I appreciate the attention that Douglas Adams and the team placed on the quality of the actors and acting throughout the game. Moving on to the narrative and story, you play as some unnamed, unimportant individual who one evening decides to sit down and play a computer game, as we all often do. So you sit down at your desk, pop open your CD drive, and insert your disc of choice, ready to lose yourself for a couple of hours. Suddenly, though, you hear a noise above you, and a split second later, a gigantic starship has crashed into your house and through your roof. As the dust settles, you're greeted by Edmund Lucy Fentable, the doorbot, who explains that you're in the presence of the Starship Titanic, a ship that cannot possibly go wrong. Well, it turns out the ship did in fact go wrong, as the central artificial intelligence of the ship has gone haywire, and it's affecting every single robot on the ship. It's up to you to join Starship Titanic's crew and figure out what's going on, restore the ship to a functional state, and hopefully return home safely. So as it relates to the game's story, I have a few different, somewhat conflicting thoughts. On one hand, the core narrative theme of the game, the high-level story setup, is great, and I thought the game did a stellar job in setting up your adventure, at least for the first 30 or so minutes of gameplay. After that, though, man, I don't know if I was playing the game wrong or what, but I had a very difficult time actually extracting the story from the game. I understand the way it's supposed to work. You're supposed to be able to get most of the story exposition from interacting with the robots spread about the ship, all through the text parser interface we mentioned earlier. But what ended up happening in practice was decidedly not that. In short, no matter what I typed or tried, I didn't get anything resembling a meaningful story or narrative thread outside of the opening section of the game and the closing sequence that leads to the game's ending. Everything in between was very hit or miss, and most of the game I spent simply bumbling about, attempting to solve puzzles because they were there, rather than because I had a reason to do so. The biggest issue here is that other than knowing you need to fix the ship's central AI, there's nothing else in-game that I personally found that informs you as to why you're gathering pieces of an entity named Titania, or why you need to do that. Now eventually you realize that Titania is in fact the AI you're trying to repair, which kinda makes sense given the name of the ship is the Starship Titanic. But I felt like there was some lore here that I was definitely missing. It wasn't for lack of trying though, as I attempted asking various robots about Titania and they all pretty much responded as though I were a three-headed monkey, which is to say, they didn't give me any meaningful info. This surprised me, because ostensibly, Titania is the central force on the ship. You'd think that robots would be able to fill you in on what her deal was if you asked, but they never do. I admit that it's entirely possible I was typing the wrong keyword combinations into the text parser, which would have caused the computer to understand, or actually misunderstand, what I was trying to ask. But even if I accept that, then all that means is that the text parser isn't really all that good, because my questions and statements were not in any way complex. Interestingly though, I discovered via some online sleuthing that if you ask the game's inhabitants about the musical group the Spice Girls, they actually go on for minutes long worth of conversation about the relevant in the 90s pop stars. That, I'm sure, was voice acting time well spent. The fact that I felt like I was missing a good chunk of actual story and lore is a shame, because the story and lore that I did get was all interesting and written exceedingly well, with every bit of text absolutely dripping with Douglas Adams' wit and wordplay, which I personally really enjoy. As a fan of Adams, I really wanted to devour as much content in the game as I possibly could, and I felt like the game thwarted me here, somewhat arbitrarily. So, from an overall story standpoint, I liked the concept and the initial story setup, but felt betrayed by how walled off the rest of the story was, which is a true shame, and even goes against Douglas Adams' own goals for the game. Recall that Adams, while a fan of Myst, had some pretty heavy critique for that game, saying that there was very little going on, and suggesting that adding characters would make the experience dramatically better. Well, there are definitely characters in Starship Titanic, but because of how difficult it is to actually extract story nuggets or even flavor text from those characters, the game doesn't really feel all that more dynamic than Myst did. Definitely a miss from my perspective. Moving on to the playability and controls. Oh boy, do I have a lot to talk about here. To start though, let's cover the controls really quickly, which like we talked about affects two distinct styles of gameplay. One is point and click driven, which functions pretty much exactly like a traditional first-person point and click adventure title, though here I do have a couple of critiques. For one, the game's design team, for some reason, decided that interacting with certain objects in the game world didn't require any sort of mouse over icon change, or highlight, or anything. There are items and objects in the world where your cursor simply stays as an arrow, which in most other games signifies nothing to do here. Not so in Starship Titanic, and you'll find that randomly clicking some spots will give you a bit of additional details, or might allow you to do something in the environment. At least, sometimes, because this mechanic is entirely inconsistent, as there is a use icon also, which does appear when mousing over certain other objects and hotspots. So why not just standardize on a consistent approach? I honestly don't know. And this same kind of thing applies to examining, so to speak, the game world, as sometimes clicking with your arrow icon will give you some sort of description, while other times a magnifying glass will appear, which ironically does not always give you a description of what you're looking at. Seriously, who thought this lack of consistency in controls would be a good thing? The actual act of controlling the game using your mouse works fine, and all of your controls and clicks are responsive. But not knowing what's going to happen when you click your mouse? That is a bigger issue. And even further, there are certain objects that in almost any other game are simply usable, like, as an example, an elevator. In most games, when you approach an elevator, clicking it will open its doors, or do something that would indicate you can actually use the object. In Starship Titanic, you have to navigate to a different section of your interface and click the call button, which feels like an unnecessary step. Admittedly, that additional section of the interface is used for a bunch of different objects you can interact with, so eventually you will get used to this aspect of the title. But I do have to question why the designers felt a need to add what is effectively an extra click to the act of interacting with certain objects. Outside of navigation, you do have an inventory that you'll eventually expand as you pick up various items in the game world, which are usually denoted by a pickup icon, prompting you to drag that item into your inventory. Using items is a simple matter of dragging the item from your inventory onto whatever hotspot or character you want to interact with, and then releasing your mouse button, which for the most part works okay, though there are a couple sections of the game where you need to repeatedly use an item on a certain object or hotspot in the world, all without any real kind of feedback that indicates you're doing something right or wrong. This, for me, caused me getting stuck several times, because in my mind, when I use an item on something in an adventure game, I expect something to happen, assuming there is something actually programmed to happen when I'm doing that action. We have looked at a couple of adventure games previously where you have to examine an item multiple times before the game unveils what you need to do with it, or allows you to retrieve a hidden item, and each time this has happened, I have criticized the game for it. Now, most of those examples involve maybe examining an item twice or 3 times, and each time you do it, you're actually getting some sort of information that indicates something is changing, at least after the first click. So at least you're getting feedback that your actions may in fact be doing something. Well, in Starship Titanic, There are situations where you have no way of knowing that you're actually doing the right thing until something randomly happens. And I have to say, I hate this aspect of the gameplay. There should never be a time where you get literally no feedback that something is working, if you are in fact doing something that quote unquote is the right way of doing it. There were multiple occasions where I walked away from a spot, assuming I was doing the wrong thing, only to discover that I had to do the same exact thing I was doing, just more of it, until eventually something would happen. No. Just no. This is bad game design. Okay, let's move on to something more positive, as there are a few interesting mechanics that the game includes that are a bit different than other contemporary titles. One of those interesting mechanics is the succubus system, which is effectively a means to transport certain items from one location to another, rapidly and without needing to store those items in your inventory. This really only comes into play in a few puzzles in the game, as most of the time you simply walk around with items in your inventory just like any other game. But sometimes you may need to transport something that might escape from your inventory, or you may need to transport something that has to remain hot when it reaches its destination. In these cases, chilling out in your pockets simply won't do. You need to use the pneumatic succubus tube system, otherwise you won't be able to solve those puzzles. Actually sending items around the world involves using another mechanic, which is the fact that each location you encounter in the game world has a distinct chevron-based symbol that acts like a pseudo QR code, where the location is coded within the description of the chevron symbol. These symbols are used to tell where you want certain items sent within the succubus tube system. As an example, if you want to send an item to your room, you drag the chevron symbol representing your room over the succubus robot, after which you can give the succubus your item and click send, which will send the item to your room. Then, the next time you go into your room, you can access your succubus and click receive, which will get you the item that you sent. It's actually a pretty cool mechanic, even though it does feel kinda arbitrarily bolted on as a means of adding more complexity to certain puzzles. The other main mechanism for controlling the game and interacting with the game world is the game's text parser section, which on paper sounds like an awesome addition to the game. 16 hours of recorded dialogue, over 500 unique keywords leading to different responses, some of which are lengthy, combined with impeccably voice-acted lines. That sounds amazing. Well, unfortunately, in practice, I ended up getting more variations of "what the heck are you talking about" as opposed to anything meaningful or pertinent to the game's story. I've read that there are quite a few Easter eggs hidden in the dialogue, if you're able to figure out what combinations of keywords unlock them, but honestly, I was so disenfranchised with the inability of the game to recognize my inputs that were related to the game that I didn't feel the desire to ask the game about different topics that likely had no relevance, like the aforementioned Spice Girls reference. I'll admit that I wasn't terribly impressed with the text parser, though I recognize that this might have been a fault of my own. I'll grant that perhaps I wasn't thinking about the text interactions in the right way. I don't believe that was the case, but I'll give the game a little bit of relief on this one. What I can't give relief on, though, is the fact that the game's interface, generally speaking, fought me a good portion of the time I was playing the game, and as a result, puzzles that made sense in theory had arbitrary impediments to solving them that felt truly unneeded. I'll give you a few examples, and just a warning, there are some slight spoilers here, because there's literally no way for me to convey my thoughts and provide adequate examples without giving some very minor aspects of certain puzzles away. Anyway, in one part of the game, you're exploring a hotel room and notice that a nearby light bulb, approximately eye level, is loose. Well, I did what any normal person would do. I attempted to click on the light bulb to take it out and place it in my inventory. "No," said the game, "you cannot do that. What you need to do is call the bellbot and ask him to retrieve the light bulb for you." Okay, fine. Maybe I can accept the fact that I'm a super high maintenance guy and literally have to have robotic help to unscrew a light bulb. Actually, there's probably a joke hidden in here. Something like, "How many first-class passengers does it take to unscrew a light bulb?" And the answer is 0, because we get the robots to do it. Get it? Oh, I am truly sorry for that joke. But seriously, why the heck couldn't I get the bulb myself? Or another example. There comes a point where you meet a parrot who is very obviously interested in wanting to eat pistachios. Okay, got it. So I look around, and eventually I find a veritable treasure trove of the delicious nuts. I go to pick up the pistachios, only to discover I can't. So I figure I might need to scoop them into a container. So I do that, only to discover that, nope, can't do that either. No, the solution here is to get the parrot to accompany you to the spot where the pistachios are, which is itself a separate puzzle. Click the pistachios, and then, and only then, will the parrot settle in for a pistachio-fueled feast. Okay, I get it. Maybe the parrot won't accept a handful of nuts from a stranger, which I admit would certainly set off some red flags for myself if someone walked up to me with a bunch of pistachios and told me to eat them. I'd probably think that person was nutty, so perhaps the parrot is being similarly cautious. My final example comes from a bit later, where you have to gather a bunch of ingredients to mix a drink called the Titanic titular, which, by the way, is a pretty awesome name for a mixed drink. Putting that aside, though, there comes a point where you have to acquire pureed starlings, a puzzle that I'm not going to spoil here. So for the purposes of our discussion, assume you already figured out how to puree those starlings, and now you simply need to retrieve that puree for the drink you're trying to make. What you'll discover is that the pureed starlings are distributed from a food dispenser where you can also retrieve an endless supply of chickens because, well, I honestly don't know why, but just stick with me here. So, you find the pureed starlings dispenser, and like a normal sane person, I think, hey, I'll just hold this glass under the starling juice dispenser to get what I need. Only, nope, the game doesn't like that. No, what I need to do is hold a chicken under the pureed starlings dispenser, and then maneuver a glass underneath that dispenser as the chicken is getting starlinged, catching some of the runoff starling essence along the way. Even if I accept the fact that the topping dispensing machine is intelligent enough to know the difference between a chicken and a glass, I still think the solution here is exceedingly cumbersome. And those puzzles, in a nutshell, are perfect examples of why the game's puzzle design is too convoluted for its own good. I can get my head around illogical puzzles whose solutions make sense in a game's world, but what I really don't like is when I know the solution to a given puzzle, but the game's mechanics actively prevent me from doing the logical thing that I need to do, instead focusing on extra steps or mechanics just to make things more challenging. That's not true difficulty. That is as artificial as it comes, and unfortunately, Starship Titanic has a lot of that going on. While all of that critique was admittedly cathartic, I don't want you to come away from this thinking that there are no redeeming qualities here, because there are absolutely puzzles in the game that reward careful observation and lateral thinking, such as a puzzle chain that involves creating some music and eventually using that music in a first-class restaurant. But the puzzle design is consistently inconsistent, and because of that, it leaves a bit of a sour taste in my mouth. Overall, Starship Titanic is one of those games that caused me great pain to think about, because it is an experience that is amazingly charming and funny, while at the same time being nearly impossible to figure out, often to the point of wanting to bang your head on your keyboard. A lot. It'd be one thing if the game was simply illogical and had poor design, but the reality is, the conceptual pieces behind most of the game's design is sound. It's just the arbitrary impediments or extra steps for certain puzzles and in-game actions that make the whole thing feel worse than it should. I didn't have an awful time playing Starship Titanic, but I would be lying if I said it was a smooth experience. It most assuredly was not, and I think you need to be a very specific kind of adventure gamer to really see the merits of the title. For most, I think this will be a mixed bag at best. So what is our overall verdict on Starship Titanic? Well, Starship Titanic attempted to do a lot of things right, and I truly believe it warrants attention, as it is somewhat revolutionary in its attempt to humanize Myst-like adventures with a jolt of personality and humor, and in some areas, the game absolutely excels. At the same time, though, the game is also a bit of a failure due to the misshapen ideas of its designer, whose talent for presenting and solving crazy illogical situations on the written page did not, at least from my perspective, translate as easily to an interactive medium. I do consider Starship Titanic to be an important game, and it is a classic in the context of the adventure game medium, but I would be lying if I said it didn't have some faults, some of which are pretty challenging to look past, especially when compared to modern design sensibilities. For those reasons, as well as the criticisms I've already levied on the title, I believe Starship Titanic is pretty much the definition of a mediocre mention. It is entirely possible that you'll enjoy playing the game, and if you're a Douglas Adams fan like I am, you will definitely see some silver linings to the otherwise gray clouds that make up the holistic experience of playing the game. Even so, this is not an experience for the uninitiated, and if you pick it up thinking you're going to get a light and breezy experience without any frustrations, you would be sorely mistaken. I definitely do not recommend this for everyone, though if you do have an interest in trying it out, it's entirely possible you may come away from it with an appreciation for what the development team tried to do, more so than what they actually accomplished. I'm definitely in this camp, as I see the merits of the design, but feel like the implementation left a lot to be desired, which is why for me, Starship Titanic sets sail as the newest addition to our list of mediocre mentions. That was our episode on Starship Titanic. I hope you all enjoyed listening to it as much as I enjoyed creating it. If you'd like to reach out, let me know how I'm doing, provide feedback, comments, suggestions, or just talk about classic games and technology in general. I would love to hear from you, and there are a few ways you can reach out. I have an X account with the handle @ClassicGamingT. I have an email address, which is classicgamingtoday@gmail.com, and we have a Discord server. The link is in the show notes. Discord is the best way to get in touch with me and the rest of the community around this podcast. We have a ton of fun out on Discord. I highly encourage you all to check it out. I also highly encourage you to check out our Patreon. It's patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday. If you want even more Classic Gaming Today goodness, including an exclusive bi-weekly podcast expansion pack, patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday is where it's at. Before we sign off for the week, I do want to mention that our next episode is going to focus on Monkey Island 2, LeChuck's Revenge. This is another Patreon-sponsored episode. This one was sponsored by ISO. So I am definitely looking forward to talking about that one. If you have any particularly fond or not so fond memories of that experience, definitely let me know. I'd also like to remind everybody that coming up in just around a month is going to be our listener grab bag Sounds of the Classics episode. So if you want your own selection featured in that episode, definitely reach out and let me know. I would love to include what everybody wants to listen to and also hear your personal experiences associated with those songs. At the same time, I also recognize you're likely listening to this podcast on any number of podcast services. And if you would feel so inclined, it would be great if you could leave me a review. This is not about bolstering star counts. This is not about trying to harvest a ton of 5-star ratings, though if that happens, awesome, it means we're doing something right. No, what it's really all about is trying to make sure that I can deliver the best possible podcast I can. The only way to do that is to get feedback from all of you to make sure that I'm hitting the mark with the content you all want to listen to. We get new listeners every single day, which is absolutely amazing. I want to make sure that I can continue to deliver the podcast that you all want and continue to make the best possible podcast I can. We'll be back in around a week with our next episode focused on Monkey Island 2, LeChuck's Revenge. Until then, remember, sometimes the games of the past are just as good, if not better, than the games of today. Goodbye, everyone.